starts Friday the 10th of July on BBC One and iPlayer.
Am I red?
What's on the minds of our under-30s? Let's find out now on BBC One with Fiona Bruce.
Welcome to Question Time. On tonight's panel, Steve Barclay, former Brexit Secretary under Theresa May, currently the government's Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Labour's Shadow Minister for Domestic Abuse and Safeguarding. She ran for leader of the party before stepping aside and is known for her outspoken campaigns from the backbenches. Jess Phillips. Theo Paphitis, entrepreneur and owner of companies such as Ryman's and Robert Dias. He started his first company at the age of 23 and went on to become a familiar face on the BBC's Dragon's Den. Iona Bain, writer and broadcaster and founder of Young Money, a website dedicated to young people's finances. And spoken word artist, rapper and social commentator George Mpanga, better known as George the Poet. Good evening. Welcome to my panel here in the studio. Welcome to Jess and Iona, who are joining us down the line. And, of course, to our audience. Thank you very much, our virtual audience. You are all under 30 this evening. Lucky you. And thank you very much for joining us. And thank you watching at home. And if you want to join the conversation, you can in the usual way on social media at BBC Question Time. So, our first question tonight is from Suresh Bindra.
I welcome the easing of lockdown so people can move on with their life. Life is all about risks, and having been under the complete control of the state since March the 21st, is it not time to allow people who are aware of the risks now to make decisions about how they want to approach this situation, given we live in a free, liberal society?
Theo.
Wow, control of the state, that's one way of putting it. I think they were trying to keep us safe. I don't think anyone of us wants to be kept locked up. But the reality was, if we hadn't had the lockdown, many of us wouldn't be here today, especially oldies like me. So I think we've had to endure that, and we have to come out of this sooner rather than later. I totally agree, because otherwise we're going to have a lot of unintended consequences. And that's things that will be a lot worse than possibly, some minor outbreaks of the actual virus. So it's important that we come out now. It's important that we adopt the new normal, because it is the new normal. We will never be back to normal until we get one or two things: a vaccine or a successful treatment. When we've got those two things, we can get back to normal. Until then, we will be under control one way or another, and we better stick to it, otherwise we'll be on total lockdown.
Well, you say stick to it. I mean, Jess Phillips, the rules are pretty complex now, and of course they're different in different parts of the UK. And what Suresh is saying, is it not time to allow people to make decisions about how they want to approach this situation?
Look, I mean, that's ultimately what we want for everybody. We want everybody to feel free and be able to go around and do how they would have done prior to lockdown. But, I mean, where I live, lots and lots of people have died, and all over the country that is the case. But in areas like the one I represent, which has large proportions of poorer communities and BME communities, we've seen terrible rates of deaths. And so, as Theo said, these controls were to try and keep us safe. But it is very confusing for people. And so I think that fundamentally now, people are going to start just doing what they think is right, because it seems there is a changing landscape with the communication that we're hearing. I've had people this week, pregnant women, saying to me, well, I'm in my third trimester, can I go out? Older people who were shielding saying, well, what are the rules for me? And I think it needs much clearer communication, and also an understanding that this isn't to control. This wasn't to try and... The government, I could criticise them on a lot of things. I don't think that they're out there to try and control our minds or our liberty. The reality is we need to be able to trust the government in what they say and listen when they speak and believe that it's based on our welfare. And at the moment, I feel that the communication is a bit confusing.
Steve, making decisions, allowing people to make decisions about how they want to approach a situation, is that what we've seen in Bournemouth today, where a major incident was declared because so many people descended onto Bournemouth and onto the beach?
Well, obviously, what we're seeing in Bournemouth is very disappointing today. But as Theo says, the lockdown only works with the consent of the people. We have to trust the vast majority of people complied with the lockdown because they saw the advice from the Chief Medical Officer, the advice from the Chief Scientific Officer. They saw what was happening in other countries where health systems were overwhelmed and recognised we needed to protect the NHS and take the lockdown, as Theo says, to save lives. That is the measures that were taken. But it is a balance in terms of some, as the questioner says, is concerned as to the lockdown being too much. Others, like Jess, feel it was insufficient. So,
but do you think the scenes...
But we've got to trust the common sense of the British public.
Well,
you can't legislate for every single scenario. And the vast majority, yes, there's been an issue in Bournemouth today, but the vast majority of the British public...
there was also a rave in Brixton last night in South London.
There will always be exceptions, but the vast majority of the British public have exercised their common sense, have worked to protect the NHS, have made huge sacrifices, but it's right now that we restart the economy because there's consequences to that as well.
Do you think it was inevitable in some way that we would see a scene like we did at Bournemouth today, when you have the Prime Minister just 2 days ago, when he was asked by a Brighton MP about how seaside towns should respond to a potential influx of people such as we have seen. He said, "I'll be calling on local representatives to show some guts and champion their communities as venues for people to return to and support." Do you think that's helpful, given what we've seen today?
Well, what we said is people need to exercise common sense, observe 2 metres where they can, but there are circumstances, and I'm sure we'll come on to them from a business perspective, where there are pressures which are impacting people's lives on their jobs, people losing their jobs, their livelihoods. That also has health consequences as well, both from a macro level in terms of the ability of the state to pay for things like our NHS, but also in terms of pressures such as on mental health. So there's a balance to be struck. I think on the whole, the British public have responded extremely well in observing the lockdown, but it's right now that we restart the economy.
Kirsty.
Hi. So as someone from the shielding category, I've actually got kidney failure, so I've been pretty much in isolation for 3 months. The idea of just completely releasing lockdown kind of terrifies me, to be honest. In Brighton today already, the beaches were incredibly crowded, and I feel like if we reduce lockdown anymore, things like that are going to happen more. We had tons of people coming down to Brighton, and I can't do anything. I don't look ill, so when I'm out and about and I've starting to go out in society, people don't know I'm ill, and so people my health is reliant on other people's actions, and that's quite scary because I feel very out of control of my own situation.
Kofi, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so in similar vein to that, I also live with a vulnerable person who happens, like myself, to be BAME. And we've seen a lot covered on the news about how the BAME community in particular are very vulnerable to this virus. And when we look at other countries who have lifted the lockdown, we've seen that there have been some spikes in the virus. Now, obviously the government, they're dealing with 2 priorities. So one is to protect lives, and the other is to protect the economy. So I'm just wondering, if we're doing both, what sort of plan is the government going to come up with to make sure that 2 and 2 don't come together here, and that we are also ensuring that those who are particularly vulnerable and those of the BAME community in particular will be protected while lifting these restrictions.
And Suresh, you asked a question.
Yes, so thank you for letting me respond. I completely agree with what Theo said. I do think that the lockdown being implemented when it was implemented was the correct time. But I think now the indirect effects of the lockdown, nobody can quantify those. So you can't quantify the massive impact to children's mental health. They've been away from education for 6 months. People are missing cancer appointments. Cancer is a potent disease. So I think the lockdown should be eased as quickly as possible in a safe way. And people are now aware of the risks, so they can choose to accept those. And I think that the economy does need to get moving, as well as other issues too. So I do welcome the lockdown being eased slowly.
So, George, Suresh's question was, is it time to allow people to make their own decisions about how they approach this pandemic?
Thanks for the question, Suresh. Well, I think people making their own decisions is contingent on them having reliable information. And unfortunately, I don't get that from this government. I don't feel like we're having consistent, clear messaging. When the lockdown was initially imposed, it was very unclear, the details of that lockdown. As these measures have been eased, we've been told to factor in the R0 number or we make arbitrary decisions about what's appropriate behaviour, where most of us can't really figure out what even the threshold for achieving what the government was once describing as herd immunity would be. So I take Steve's point about the British public not being stupid, but we really need clear and consistent messaging.
Iona?
Well, I think that Suresh has quite rightly brought up the concerns about the economy, but also about people's mental and physical health during this time. And obviously, lockdown across the whole country is not sustainable. And therefore, we have to find a way, as Theo has said, of living with the virus and having some distance from the virus and making sure we can do that safely until we find a vaccine or an effective treatment. And I also completely understand Kirsty and Kofi's concerns about coming back out into society if they don't feel that it is absolutely 100% safe yet to be back out there. And these are the two competing concerns that we're having to consider right now, and there are no easy choices to make. But when we look at what happened in Bournemouth today, I think we need to appeal to people's sense of responsibility. And I think most people have complied remarkably well with the lockdown, especially young people. I think this next generation coming through have really defied this snowflake stereotype that's been applied to them too many times and have actually shown themselves to be very compassionate, very responsible and very stoic. And I'm sure that we can appeal to their sense of responsibility and say, look, try and have some good judgment about situations like going to the beach. If you think it's too crowded, try and stay away, because it would be so devastating for us to have to go back into a second lockdown, both financially and for our health.
Well, lots of you have got your hands up in our virtual audience. Hannah.
Thank you. I think what Suresh said about people accepting the risk is not the full story. You accept the risk for yourself by breaking lockdown, by wishing that lockdown was over sooner. But you don't accept the risk for people like key workers who don't have a choice. They have to leave the house. For example, my dad was 55. He was a key worker and he passed away from coronavirus.
Oh, Hannah, I'm so sorry to hear that.
Thank you. When you say that people can make their own choice and accept the risk, you also accept the risk for the people you will infect.
And that, of course, that's the different thing about this pandemic, isn't it? That it's not necessarily just the risk you take on yourself, it's how you affect other people as well. Emma?
Yeah, it's really to echo what Hannah just said, and that, you know, my family are all pretty much NHS workers, so although you might be taking the risk yourself, if you get ill, you end up in hospital. It's putting people like that at risk as well. And George also mentioned about, you know, having clear messaging and you know, people using that to make decisions. Well, the daily briefings are gone. So, I mean, I'm in Scotland. We're quite lucky where we are. We still have some, you know, visibility of what's going on. But in the rest, in England, as far as I'm aware, it's almost like it's back to business as usual.
Daniel.
Yeah, so I just wanted to make a comment about the lockdown. So I live, both my parents are in that vulnerable at-risk category. So I've been in lockdown for over 4 months now because instead of following what the government advice was, I decided that it was probably safer for us to lock down earlier. Because if you look at when we locked down compared with every other country in Europe, including Germany, we came out later. So I just want to ask the government if they think that their advice has either been clear or sensible, because the number of people I know that have died from the virus, it's over 10 now. So it's I don't feel like I've been able to put my full faith in the government in looking after my parents.
Gosh, 10 people, Daniel. You know, 10 people who've died from the virus. My goodness.
I've got one friend, his uncle and his father died within a month period.
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. I mean, Steve, this is... it's interesting, isn't it? Because we have a panel here of people under 30, and you're not all necessarily saying the same thing, but it's interesting how many of you are saying, caution, you know, let's not rush into this. People are vulnerable. You yourselves perhaps are vulnerable because you have underlying illnesses or you live with people who have them. And you've had George and a number of people there talking about they don't feel they're getting clear messaging.
Well, you hear from the personal loss and the tragedy of that why the lockdown was necessary to get the infection down, which it's done, to protect the NHS. to ensure that we met the 5 tests we set.
What about what they're saying about the messaging not being clear?
But just to answer George's question where he said that the lockdown wasn't clear enough, quite the opposite. If you look at the stay-at-home message, for example, the sage advice was up to 20% of children continuing to go to school. It actually dropped to fewer than 2%. So actually the lockdown was highly effective. The question is, how do you then balance? And again, one of the comments was that we're now lifting it in its entirety. We're not. It's in a staged way. So there's still many areas, like theatres, like gyms, we may come on to it, areas where people are saying we're not lifting the lockdown quickly enough because they want to get to work. They're worried about their livelihoods. So it's a balance, but the messaging was very clear.
And do you think it's clear now?
With that, and that's enabled us to get the infection rate down in the way that we have.
So just on that point, let me just clarify what I was trying to say. It's not that the idea of lockdown wasn't clear when it was established. It's that, first of all, the leader of your government missed 5 COBRA meetings, advice...
That's how COBRA works.
OK, fine. Advice from top scientists was ignored for a while. As the point was made from the panel, we were the last of the rich countries, definitely, to enact a lockdown in our geographic neighbourhood. And there has been reports from very credible people in the medical community that say if action was taken even 2 weeks later, there would be a significant dent in the number of dead from COVID-related deaths. Even as late as April, I think the government was denying that there was a significant risk to care facilities, and by mid-May, 40% of COVID-related deaths had come from care homes. So I think it would go a long way if your government began to show a little bit of contrition and acknowledgement of the mistakes that have been made in the handling of this crisis up to this point, as opposed to the nitpicking and the point arguing that we've seen on Twitter, very strangely, from this government in particular.
Jess?
I mean, I agree with lots of that. And part of the problem with the communication that I certainly have found as a constituency MP, let alone a citizen with children out of school, is that the government would stand in front of us and say things like, we've put a protective ring around care homes. And I felt at times like I was going mad because I was talking to my care homes and hearing the reality on the ground. And, I think that the idea that we need complete honesty and complete trust, and it's hard to trust politicians at the best of times, I get that. But at the moment, we need real trust and honesty in our politics, because that is the only way that any consent of either the lifting of lockdown or if we have to go back into it, or as we had seen when we had to go into it, is going to work. And it has just felt a bit confused. It has felt sometimes like there was one rule for one and one rule for another in the very, very famous case now. And it's not... we're just asking for honesty, I think, as citizens, and certainly as the opposition. I want the government to do well, but I do have to feel that I can trust that they're telling the truth.
OK, let's take another question now from Iman Anwar.
Hi. With youth unemployment on the rise and worries over further negative impacts on our economy and recovery, and as a recent graduate as of December 2019, what assurances do I have as a young person entering the professional world of work that there will be enough opportunity available for me?
And what's your situation, Iman?
So I had a job offer in the advertising industry, which I was, which is what I graduated in, but it was revoked because of lockdown. And they said that because of their financials for the rest of the year and the worry around coronavirus, they weren't really sure if they could keep my new employment. So I'm just a little bit concerned about if there is enough, young people already don't have enough opportunity as it is in the professional space. So I'm just worried about what plan the government has to sort of bring that opportunity up for us.
And so you had a job which is now gone. Are you working at all at the moment?
Yeah, I currently work in food supply. It was my part-time job at university, and luckily I didn't hand in my notice, so I can still, luckily I could still work there.
So what, a supermarket, something like that?
Yeah.
Right. And just out of interest, a hands up of our audience, how many of you are either out of work or have been furloughed? Right, OK. What's going to happen to young people, Steve? I mean, Boris Johnson talked about they should all have apprenticeships. A lot of people seem to be taken by surprise by that. Is that going to happen?
Yes, well, the key challenge really before is jobs. And if you look at what happened going into the pandemic, we had halved the rate of unemployment amongst the young. But the young tend to be the first to feel the impacts of a recession. Which is why, if you look at the figures now for the 18 to 24s, they're 10% of the working age population, but 18% of welfare claimants. So they tend to feel hardest first and are often in the sectors like hospitality, tourism, where the impacts are greatest. So the strategy has been first to protect as many jobs as possible. That's why we've had the furlough scheme, which has protected over 9 million jobs at a significant cost of over £22 billion. The self-employment scheme, which has protected again, around 2.5 million jobs, a cost of £7.5 billion. Why we supported 850,000 businesses through the grant scheme, investing again £10 billion into that. So there's been very significant measures alongside all the things we've done on cash flow to support businesses as well. So there's been
what
a
about
package
these
of measures to protect
apprenticeships?
jobs. Now, moving forward, you're right, you then go from that protect phase onto the next phase, which is how do we restart the economy? What are the jobs that we can then move to from those areas of the economy where jobs are being lost? So greening the economy, looking at the challenge as the first major economy to set the test of net zero by 2050. What are the jobs in there?
But just very specifically, what about Boris Johnson has pledged apprenticeships for young people? When might that happen?
We're absolutely committed to that. So the Chancellor will give a statement in July, which will be all about the next phase, talking about how we green the economy, how we respond with the infrastructure projects, because we're absolutely right, jobs, particularly for young people, is one of the key challenges before us, and that's very much what we're focused on within the Treasury at the moment.
Iona.
Well, if I could just jump in here, because I think Stephen is absolutely correct to say that young people's jobs right now need to be right at the top of the priority list, because we know that young people are the most likely to have been furloughed, to have had their wages and hours cut as a result of this crisis, and to have lost their jobs altogether. And they're also the most likely to be working in the industries that have been hardest hit by lockdown, like retail, tourism and hospitality. And there are predictions that there could be youth unemployment rising by 600,000 this year, because people who are leaving education this year are coming into a really tough jobs market, the toughest that we've ever seen. So we need specific measures. And I have to say, listening to Stephen there, I'm surprised he didn't mention more about apprenticeships and the apprenticeship levy and the fact that it has not been a success. Since it was introduced in 2017, it was meant to get more young people, particularly from disadvantaged backgrounds, into apprenticeships to give them better life chances. But what we've seen is that participation rates among those from more disadvantaged backgrounds has fallen by a third. The apprenticeships have gone more to those from privileged backgrounds. And we see within the rules that actually the apprenticeship levy can be used to send managers on courses to get MBAs. I don't think that's what the apprenticeship levy was meant for. It's meant to help young people find their feet in the world of work. So it's not necessarily even about spending more money, although there could be a case for more targeted funding. It's about spending the money well and making sure it's actually going to young people in the labour market.
Katie, you got your hand up.
Hi, I work in hospitality, so I'm currently furloughed and have been since the middle of March. I'm lucky, as in I'm 26, so I've done hospitality for quite some number of years. So I've already got experience behind me. So if somebody was more likely to keep me on rather than somebody who's kind of 17, 18 and it's their part-time job while they're studying, I don't necessarily disagree with Iman. I can see the point that he's making, but I also think that for a while, university degrees have been advertised as the way to go, and studying things like I studied music at university. I know people that have studied kind of like maths and things like that. I think younger people don't necessarily have the opportunity to go into something like a trade, which is probably more valuable. I do think there's a community of people who want to be influencers and YouTubers and things like that. I'm not saying that's everyone. Obviously, everyone is different, but I do feel like that is where people would probably find more work if they were interested in more like a trade rather than being an influencer.
Niamh.
Hi, yeah. I think I dread to think what it's going to be like. I graduated last September and I've been in between waiting to start my master's and saving money for that. And it was already next to impossible for me to find a job this year. So with the pandemic and with Brexit, I dread to think what it's going to be like for those graduating this year. For me, the jobs that I did find were minimum wage. They didn't cover your living expenses. You'd have to top that up with benefits. There's unpaid internships, completely unpaid. Nothing's paid. They're given disproportionately to privileged people. And I know Stephen Barclay reeled off all these stats about young people and where they were, working in hospitality. So that really worries me because you know these things, but there wasn't a pandemic before. So young people are suddenly on your radar.
Kirsty.
So I was just wondering, this is kind of mainly aimed at Steve, because I feel like, particularly it's been raised by the pandemic, there's more opportunities for people to work online, and with everything going on at the moment, I feel like self-employment should actually be encouraged, and I don't feel like the Conservative government are actually really encouraging people, and it's particularly younger people. There's plenty of opportunities. I get off my own back and do a lot of things, and I feel like we should be encouraging self-employment and small businesses more.
Look, Steve, I'll come back to you. Theo, I mean, if we can talk about self-employment, obviously you were an entrepreneur from the get-go. But you know, hearing from Niamh there, I mean, there's a whole swathe of people who are thinking, what are my job prospects going to be? If we're facing possibly the worst recession since the Second World War, if not much further back than that, it looks pretty bleak.
Fiona, I couldn't put it better myself. It's going to be tough. Unemployment's going to rise. The job market is going to be incredibly difficult. Youngsters are going to face a tsunami of job losses. And this is one of the few times I'm going to say this, because I've always believed in a very free economy and non-discrimination, but we need to start looking at some very positive discrimination where we can actually address the issues of people of a certain age with support to employers to make sure we encourage that. I think we need to really understand that.
What you mean, encourage young people in and older people out?
Well, no, not at all. We're now that'd be bad news. No, my first job. So I left school at 16, very little qualifications, dyslexic, sent something like 100 applications out and got like 100 rejections. Mind you, my applications wouldn't have been a good reading with my spelling. But actually, the only reason I got a job, my first job, was because at the time the government were giving allowances to businesses. I think it was about 1,500 quid a year. It wasn't a lot of money, but to take on somebody of a certain age who hadn't had a job before. And so they took me on when they were really not sure that they should actually be spending 1,500 quid. But the fact was, it was subsidised. And that gave me my first job and my first opportunity. And then I could move on from there. So we need initiatives like that that are going to... Because the measures that the Chancellor's put in were required, but it was a blunt instrument, blunderbuss approach that had to be done very quickly. And I'm afraid some people went through the net. Now we need to focus a lot more and deal with category by category, industry by industry, age by age, requirement by requirement. It's hard work, and you can't just make... no disrespect to our politicians, Stephen, but the fact is, you know, the present government do like to make big announcements for PR purposes, and we just need to do the graft and the work first and actually accept that sometimes it's going to be difficult and sometimes you're going to say things that are not popular, but you just want to be respected, not liked all the time, and we must stop this wanting to be liked by the public. Let's get honest with them, tell them how it's going to be, and actually then address the difficult issues that are going to be difficult, but if you show you're working at it, people will work with you on it.
George?
I express support for much of what Theo just said and much of what the panellists said. I do think self-employment, entrepreneurship is going to be necessary moving forward as so much of our industry transforms. We're dealing with a new society. We go through it every time we see someone we think we're going to shake hands or embrace. we don't do these things anymore. There's so much that we don't do anymore. Look at the shape of this show. So now is the time for us to get creative about how we, as the incoming generation into the workforce, are going to reshape the economy.
There's lots of hands up. I'm going to come to some of you in a moment, but Jess?
I agree almost entirely with what Theo said, in that the government needs to act now to stimulate the jobs for younger people going forward. They are going to be a lost generation. And let's face it, the young people today, people who are under 30 today, have pretty much lived their entire economic lives since the 2008 downturn and have had to tighten their belts and have lost out on things that were there certainly when I was younger. And the reality is that the government needs to already have announced what it's going to do to help businesses get young people into training, into schemes. Like Theo said, there can be different sectors, there can be different standards, and it needs to be responsive to what is actually happening out there. Because without it, we're just going to end up with a generation lost. And even in the announcements last week with regard to the tutoring that school children will now get, a very welcome announcement. But an hour before the announcement was made, those aged 16 to 18 were taken out of it. And these are the people we are going to need to help, who have already lost all their youth services, had their schools cut for the entire time that they might have been there. Now is the time to step up, like Germany has already announced stimulus packages, and say, what are we going to do to create jobs and training and encourage businesses to take these people on? Because these are our children.
Suresh?
If I can just...
Iona, sorry, yes.
Say that, yes, I would say that Jess is absolutely right to say that colleges that help 16 to 19-year-olds should be included in the COVID catch-up fund, and that actually spending that little bit more time in education could make all the difference. So if we had targeted funding for booster courses that just allowed young people to build up their skills, both hard and soft, before they go into the labour market, that could make all the difference between them being employable and an attractive worker and being on the job scrap heap. But I also think that this issue is too important to descend into party politics. And we've been hearing for a long time about the need for a commission on social care, because understandably, that's going to be extremely important to address after this crisis. But I wonder whether we also need a commission on young people's opportunities and jobs, for the parties to work together and to agree that this should be a priority. And debate the details by all means, but for us to try and transcend that party politics and come together.
So, Steve, lots of ideas being thrown in your direction. Targeted jobs for young people. Iona's talking about a commission. More emphasis on entrepreneurship from Kirsty.
Well, on the one hand, move quicker, and the other, have a commission to talk about it more. I mean, well, I can reassure Theo, there's no shortage of graft in the Treasury, and officials, if you look at the schemes they put in place at speed, like the furlough, the self-improvement, the grants, and so forth, have covered a lot to protect jobs. But I absolutely agree that then the next phase to that is how then, for those jobs we're not able to protect, and the Chancellor's been very candid, we can't protect every job. There will be changes, and as the questioner picked up, there are changes in the way people are working, the use of online. If you look at GPs, only 3% of GPs were using online GP surgeries before the pandemic. Now it's up to 99%, so pretty much all. So there are changes to how people are operating online. That will change the workplace, and we're in very active discussions with employers, particularly small and medium employers, to see what schemes we can put in place to support them. But the first priority was protect as many jobs as possible. Over 9 million have been through the furlough scheme, but we then need to look at the next phase, which is how, particularly on things like apprenticeships, we get the right skills, working with the National Citizen Service as well, get the right careers advice, the right skills, the right training for people moving forward.
Well, sorry, can I just jump in? I really want to commend the Treasury for stepping in and providing so much support under the furlough arrangements. You mentioned the idea of a commission for young people being kind of talk about it more, but I think there's something more to be said about focusing on the opportunities and the challenges that will be faced by this generation and getting some significant indication of government commitment to this issue. There are a number of issues especially when we talk about housing, is a common concern across this generation, in which the government has made a lot of the right noises and talked about commitments that it's going to make, not necessarily this government, but this generation of Conservative government. And we retroactively find out that what's been happening behind the scenes, when there are no eyes on the process, is flies in the face of the sounds that you've been making. Specifically, what prompted me to say that was the recent revelations about the Robert Jenrick situation, the housing minister that's come under fire for signing off on a development, £1 billion development that looks to undermine the provision of social housing in the community that this thing is planned in. So I guess as a generation, we sometimes question the sincerity with which you engage the challenges of our age group and vulnerable communities.
Well, I know you want to come back on this. We actually have a question which addresses this point from Luke McCroy-Jones. Luke.
Hi there. So given the COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately affected certain groups, including the young, how should the government ensure that there's more support for social and affordable housing and possibly less luxury developments?
And Luke, I assume you're referring to the Housing and Local Communities Secretary, Robert Jenrick, who's obviously been on the front page of the papers for a few days now about this development in Tower Hamlets in London, which is now being reviewed. Richard is financed by Richard Desmond and his company. The question is about, should the government be doing more to support social and affordable housing? Jess?
Well, yes. Every government that has existed since I'd say probably the 1970s should have done more to build social housing and to ensure that any stock that was lost through the sale of social housing was replaced at least an equal value. The government only in 2018 allowed councils to borrow money to build social housing, which they'd stopped in 2012. So for that entire period, they had stopped councils being able to borrow money in order to build council housing. And it was only lifted a couple of years ago, and I have absolutely no idea why. Other than that, it seems that what that does is give the whip hand to rich developers to be the only people in the market for house building. And we can see from the Robert Jenrick affair how powerful they actually are, sending chummy text messages talking about not giving money, or dough, I believe was the term that was used, to the Marxists in Tower Hamlets, which of course means the children and the adults who would have used the hospitals and schools that money would have gone to. So, yes, they absolutely need to be doing more. We all need to be doing more. I'm sure that the minister on the panel will say, we've done much more than the Labour Party ever did. It's a stock standard line. And yes, you know what? The Labour Party should have built more houses. And so should this government build considerably more houses that people can actually afford to live in.
Theo?
Well, again, we're letting something overshadow what's really going on out here at the moment. And there's no question in my mind, as part of the reinvestment to get the economy going and get us out of this mess that we're undoubtedly going to get into, is a massive investment in social housing. And we must start a massive programme of building and boost the economy. There is a massive shortage. And so it's not rocket science. There's a massive shortage. We need to get people back at work. We need to invest where people need it. So social housing is the obvious place for us to go straight into, like now, not requiring any more reports, just get on with it.
Hannah, I can see you want to come in.
Hi, I completely agree that we need more social housing. People who live in social housing in cramped conditions, because there are no social housing for them, and other underprivileged people die disproportionately from COVID-19 compared to their more privileged peers.
Holly?
This seems like a typical Conservative, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. This shouldn't be something that is secondly thought about. These are people who require houses. This is one of the #1 priorities, and unfortunately with COVID, it's just gotten worse. So stop promising us X, Y, and Z and actually deliver housing.
Suresh.
I welcome the demands being put on the government in terms of investment in the youth and social housing and things such as that. But I come to the point that I made at the beginning, and I agree with Theo. To do and fulfill those demands, what we need to be doing is making sure the economy is restarted in a proportionate and a sensible way. I think there's been a lot of unfair criticism to the government by some of the panellists here and some of the other viewers. I think they should be applauded for the furlough scheme that they've done. This is an unprecedented situation. The only way they can invest more is if they can get the economy going.
Iona?
Well, the housing crisis in the UK is extraordinarily complicated. As Jess said, it's one that we've had for decades that successive governments really failed to tackle comprehensively. When you look at the specific case of Robert Jemrick, I don't want to comment on the details of the case, but what I do want to say is that in this country, the new build housing industry needs to be held to account for building homes that are overpriced to shoddy standards. And in the last week, we've seen a young couple in Leicestershire hanging a banner from the front of their house saying, buying this new built home was the worst decision we ever made. Come and ask us why. And obviously their developer wasn't particularly happy about that, tried to have it stopped, but that was their experience, and unfortunately it's all too common. What we need is to have really radical reform. To be fair, we're hearing a lot of sounds from the government about how we're going to kick the planning laws into touch, which is exactly what we need. We need to have reform of land value. So when developers buy up land, they get all profits from the gain in value of owning that land. None of it is shared with the community. But what we need is to share those profits with the community so that they can be invested back into social and affordable housing and local infrastructure. To be fair, the community infrastructure levy was supposed to do that. However, all too often it tends to be negotiated away by powerful developers, and councils cave in because they just want to get more houses built in the local area, come what may. So that's not been working, and I think that's been around longer than the current Conservative generation of politicians.
I mean, George, obviously you've talked about the Robert Jemrick situation already, but in terms of social housing overall?
Yep, for a while, as has been alluded to, the stock of social housing has been slipping into the private sector. A lot of the times it's in negotiations that the community have not been privy to. Yes, in 2018, the government did mandate that for developments above a certain number, communities need to be consulted. That is a welcome change, but there's something more pernicious that has been happening in the reduction of the social housing stock for a while.
There's quite a few of you with your hands up. Katie, you're nodding there.
Hi, I happen to live in an area of Worcestershire that has quite a lot of green belt. Whilst we do need a lot more houses, we need to be quite environmental about it. There's a lot of houses that are run down, and there's buildings that we could knock down and rebuild where they are and make them, obviously, I think, as Iona was saying, better than the new builds that are currently being built. So why on earth are contracts trying to be taken out on green belt, which should be protected environmentally, when there's brown belt places and places that should be knocked down and built with better houses? Surely that would make better use of the space that's already there.
Iman?
Hi, I just also wanted to mention about rent regulations. I think that, especially in London, rent is far too high for what people are earning. And I think the government needs to do more in people, because as a young person, it's almost impossible to save for a deposit when I'm paying rent in London that's, extortionately high, and trying to save for a deposit. So I think rent regulations is another point that the government need to look into.
And Luke, you asked the question.
Yes, yeah. I think another important consideration here, of course, is that the same city that the development, the £1 billion development was approved in, was the same city that 3 years ago to this month had the Grenfell Tower tragedy, and still there are blocks in the UK with cladding on that's deemed to be dangerous. So when is the government actually going to act and protect people in this tower block housing?
Yep. Can I just add to that point? I don't know if it's already been covered, but the CIL that levy.
That's the community infrastructure levy, which is paid for by developers and it goes towards the council for them to use for local services.
That's right. In this Robert Jenrick case, it is said that the decision to greenlight that $1 billion development was fast-tracked so as to help the developer avoid, I think, a 40 million plus payment into the community that levy would have mandated. I'd also like to make a clarification. I don't think it was the government that in 2018 decided communities should be consulted. I think it was actually the mayor.
Steve.
Well, we need to build, and I think immediately that means getting construction sites up and running. We've been supporting the construction industry through the measures we've taken, but it does, as was touched on, things like planning is still an impediment to the pace at which we want to move. So we are planning to look at that in legislation and see what we can do to speed that up.
But then you've got Katie who's worried about the green belt, for example.
We are building significantly more already, and we made very big investments into that in the budget as well. But I think it's also looking about how we build better. Because one of the things I'm very passionate about is modern methods of construction, looking at how we build where we assemble on site quicker. It's better from a climate change perspective. The energy usage in MMC is much lower, so we can build better as well. But the government is investing, has committed significant funds to this. In response to Grenfell, in particular, we committed at the budget additional funding to that as well. Some of those schemes have been slowed down because of COVID and the difficulty of actually doing work on that. I was talking with one of Jess's colleagues, Labour MP, about that just yesterday. But we have committed funding to that. We are committed to build. And one of the key things we can do now is get construction sites up and running so that industry can bounce back as quickly as possible.
But you've got quite a job on your hands. I mean, you've got over a million households who are on the social housing waiting list. And in 2018-19 in England, for example, 38,000 new social housing units were built. I mean, that's a heck of a discrepancy.
Well, that's why we've strengthened the safety net. So one of the measures that we took at the budget was to change the rent that's covered to 30% to support people in terms of the cost of rent. We've taken measures specifically about the challenges of people paying their rent by providing protection for 5 months. But ultimately, this is both a supply and a demand issue. The key thing we need to do is build more homes. We're committed to funding that, but we also need to make the planning system more friendly to delivering on that. And we also need to look at the skills. And it comes back to the earlier point. You know, skills for young people who we need to find employment for. The construction industry is a key part of that, and the infrastructure we're committing. And that's how we bounce back from the pandemic that we faced.
Let's take another question now from Emma Stevenson.
What changes that we have made in society in response to coronavirus should be kept once restrictions are lifted?
What changes should we keep? Right. Who wants to kick us off with that? Jess, you're sort of smiling and nodding. Have you got one in mind?
I mean, there are some things I've quite enjoyed about it. I quite like being at home a bit more. So maybe we could move Westminster to Birmingham post-corona. That would be good.
Yeah, good luck with that, Jess.
Andy Street would approve.
I think there's been a couple of things, actually, that we should keep. And I think that there will be an element of creativity that comes out of this in tech sectors and how we have flexibility in our lives a bit more. So I have, for many, many years, been campaigning for flexibility day one, largely for working mothers, although it would account for all working parents. And you've always been told, no, you couldn't work at home, we wouldn't be getting enough done. And we've learned that is different now. We've learned that we can be as productive when we're at home, if not more productive in actual fact. But I also think, from the perspective of somebody who cares very deeply about domestic violence and vulnerable people in their home, that for the first time the public has sort of woken up to the idea of what it would be like to be controlled and to be a prisoner in your own home. And I have seen a massive outpouring of support and care about that particular issue, as well as a real love and support for some of our key workers, the people that we can't actually live without. It didn't turn out to be the people who maybe were getting paid the most. It turned out to be low-paid key workers, often migrant workers. And I think that there's a kindness and a community that's been born.
OK, look, little hands up amongst our audience, lots of them. Kofi, we've not heard from you yet.
So just in relation to that question about what changes would be kept, I particularly am interested to know with the whole new regime of wearing masks, particularly when going on public transport. Going forward in the long term, will that be maintained? And also, will shops and stores and even public gatherings adopt a policy where, we have to wear a mask if we want to be in the shop? And will there always be, particularly in gyms, like a restricted number of people who can enter the gym at a time?
So is that something you...
where this disease can really spread?
Is that something you want to see then? Permanent, permanence to face coverings, that sort of thing? In particular spaces, probably like maybe shops and gyms and even public transport. Because when you're coming into so many contact with so many people like that, then this virus, there's still a lot that we don't know about it and its rates of transmission. I think it's important that we still have that protection and maintain sort of this policy. As you said, this is a new normal. Ben?
Yeah, I agree with what Jess Phillips was saying about job flexibility. I think in the future we're going to see a lot more people working from home, certainly a lot more of the time. I mean, especially speaking personally, as a chemist, I work in a lab every day of the week, but my company's introduced a policy of working in the lab now on alternate weeks and then working from home on other weeks, and that's been working really well. And so I definitely think we're going to be seeing that going forward. And then I think another thing, hopefully, to see in the future as well is just better hygiene across the board, because I definitely think this pandemic has increased everybody's awareness of hygiene and good hygiene practices. And so I definitely think that would be a really beneficial thing in the future with hand sanitizer and wearing face masks.
So Theo, are you going to be washing your hands a lot more from here on in? And what changes would you like to see remain?
I've got to tell you, we will never be the same again. Technology has been changing our lives over years and years and years now. But over the last 3 months, I think the technology has been accelerated by at least 5 years in the way we adopted it and we're using it. For me, I can't see myself having offices with that many people in ever again. I mean, the first thing we're going to be doing after speaking to our colleagues is cutting down the number of days that people come into the offices, which means we'll need less space. People will be able to balance their lives a lot better. And technology has done that. Retail will be very different as well. People have adopted online a lot faster than they would have done. So we are going to see a lot more pressure on our high street stores. And that's, again, something the government have got to do something about. I think the rates deferral holiday was brilliant. Get rid of it. Right. Don't bring it back. It don't make sense. It's a tax from the 1500s. Life's moved on. Ye old internet did not exist in the 1500s. So get rid of it. It needs work for you to work out for something else to bring the taxation back into the Treasury, which blatantly you need to give us our services. But you'd have to do the work. Get rid of it. It's not practical. It's destroying the fabric of our society. So lots of things will have to change.
Iona, what would you like to keep?
Well, I do agree that working from home is more civilised and enlightened where possible. But I think we should also bear in mind that actually young people do need hands-on training, mentoring in the workplace. And you can't bring on all your interpersonal skills through Zoom. I'm mentoring a young person in the financial industry at the moment, and she's quite introverted and shy. And she says it's really difficult for her to become more confident just by talking to her colleagues online. So I think that working from home has been a luxury that older people have been able to enjoy because they've had a lot of access to outdoor space, perhaps, and they've had better facilities. But younger people have been cooped up, typically,
Iona, I think it's a balance.
rented
It's a balance. It's not one or the other.
They don't know that well.
It's not one or the other.
That's a change that we have to maybe balance. But also, in the future, we're going to have to reassess how we spend our money. Perhaps prior to this, we had a very buoyant consumer economy, and obviously we want that to come back. But at the same time, individuals are looking at what they spent their money on and they're asking, does this align with my values? Did I actually need to buy that many clothes when I know what damage it does to the environment, for instance? But there are certain things that I certainly do want to come back because I don't want to keep consuming all my arts and culture on YouTube and Zoom. And we are facing a cultural extinction event unless we rescue the arts industry in this UK. And we won't know what we've got. It's gone.
So, George, what would we keep? That's some things that Iona definitely doesn't want to lose. But what would you keep if you're going to pick one thing?
I would keep I would say, upswing in general care and etiquette that we have now, understanding that we're in a pandemic, understanding that people have been endangered, I felt that person to person there's been a bit more sensitivity and attentiveness in how we check on each other and protect each other, especially from some of the online behaviours that might affect our emotional and mental well-being.
Steve, what would you keep?
I think we've had a lot of good ones, but for me, within government, it's the speed at which we act across departments. So if I look at the programme of getting food parcels to our most vulnerable as part of the shielding programme, where we brought a number of departments together, or the way we've been able to support the homeless through this crisis, get people off the streets, we saw as government acting in a very different way to perhaps the traditional model. And things are done by departments. And I think there's a lot that comes from a pandemic where people come together with a common cause, act much more quickly. As Theo says, in terms of being more data-driven around where the technology is being used for the benefit of people we're solving problems for. And I think there's ways that government can operate coming out of the pandemic where we can move much more quickly and be more data-driven.
And taking your government hat off just for a minute, on a personal level, what would you keep?
Well, as someone with 2 children under 10, I think actually seeing more of the family with that home working, as Jess says, I think all of us in Parliament spend a lot of time away from home. So I think actually that aspect is something that I've really enjoyed, and I think many of us, the flexibility around that would be great to keep.
Well, on an entirely frivolous note, I have to say the one thing I will look forward to is not having to queue at the bar in the pub, or not kind of, you know, because if you can actually just sit at the table and summon someone to come and bring you your drink, I think it'll be absolutely marvellous. I'd certainly like to keep that. We've got a couple of hands up. We've just got to very quickly. Let me just get around you, Niamh.
Yeah, I think one thing that would be really important to keep is the spotlight on issues that have come out during this time: women in abusive homes and members of the LGBTQ+ community and unsafe housing and mental health issues. And one thing to really keep, I think, is the appreciation of key workers and essential workers and health workers in particular. And I hope that's something that people won't forget about, and I hope we won't get back to the point where we're clapping when we're giving nurses, when we're denying nurses pay rises. Instead, we're clapping in appreciation.
Okay, Holly, we've got very little time left. What would you keep?
I absolutely agree with George. I think we could keep kind of kindness and appreciation for our frontline team, as I've said before, but also, why don't we as a nation be a little bit less materialistic? I don't think a lot of people have wanted to go on fancy holidays or drive fancy cars. You've probably just wanted to cuddle a loved one. So I think we need to keep those values in our society.
Well, lots of really interesting thoughts there. I just really wanted to end on that and see what you'd have to say. Thank you so much. Our hour is up, and so is this series of Question Time, I'm sad to say. We are taking a break over the summer. We'll be back in September. Who knows what the programme will be like then? Will we be approaching anything back to normality? Will we have an audience actually in the room with us? I don't know. We'll see where we are then. But thank you very much for the moment. If you want to carry on tonight's discussion, you can, as always, join Adrian, Charles and guests on Question Time Extra Time, and that is on 5 Live now. But for now, thank you very much to the panel for coming in here to the studio. Jess and Iona, thank you so much for joining us down the line. And, of course, to our brilliant audience of under 30s, thank you so much. Tried to get you all in. I really appreciate all your comments. And, of course, thank you at home for watching. We'll see you after the summer. Have a good summer. Stay safe. From Question Time. Bye-bye.
Looking at the problems facing our theatres with guests Dame Judi Dench and David Tennant. The coronavirus newscast follows next here on BBC One.
Get ready for some